The year is 1962, and the world holds its breath. For 13 days in October, the globe teeters on the edge of an abyss that most citizens cannot truly comprehend. It is the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the game being played between Washington and Moscow is one of nerve, strategy, and fate itself. In our timeline, reason and diplomacy narrowly won, and the missiles were withdrawn before the final plunge. But what if the balance tipped the other way, and reason failed to silence the war drums? On the evening of October 27th, a U-2 reconnaissance plane flying over Cuba is shot down by a Soviet surface-to-air missile. The pilot, Major Rudolph Anderson Jr., is killed instantly. And for a moment, the air in the White House seems to thicken into something almost solid. President John F. Kennedy gathers with his brother Robert and the members of ExComm, the Executive Committee of the National Security Council. In our reality, Kennedy resisted calls for immediate retaliation, choosing instead to send another message to Khrushchev. But here in this alternate timeline, the president sees the downing of the U-2 not as an accident of battlefield nerves, but as a deliberate act of war. The order is given quietly, but decisively. At 9:45 p.m. Washington time, a squadron of Navy attack aircraft launches from the USS Essex with instructions to strike the SAM site responsible. The attack goes forward under the cover of night, and as the Cuban defenders watch the first explosions rip through their positions, Soviet military advisors are caught in the blast. By dawn on October 28th, photographs of dead Soviet officers appear on Khrushchev's desk in the Kremlin, along with intelligence that American paratroopers are preparing for a possible landing in western Cuba. This is the moment the path diverges beyond recall. Khrushchev's advisors are split between restraint and escalation. The cautious voices argue that Moscow could still negotiate from a position of strength. The hardliners say that allowing the Americans to strike Soviet personnel without response would destroy the credibility of the USSR everywhere from Berlin to Hanoi. Khrushchev himself is exhausted from sleepless nights, and under the weight of humiliation, he authorizes the next step. The Soviet field commander in Cuba, General Isa Plakiev, is given permission to use tactical nuclear weapons against an invading force if it crosses into missile deployment zones. By the next afternoon, American reconnaissance flights report movement near several of the nuclear storage bunkers. The photos show trucks pulling what appeared to be missile transporters into the jungle. At sea, a Soviet submarine, designated B-59, is shadowed by the U.S. Navy, and when depth charges are dropped as a signal to surface, the captain, believing war has already started, gives the order to ready a nuclear torpedo. In our timeline, one man, Vasily Arkhipov, refused to consent to the launch, and by doing so may have saved humanity. In this darker thread of history, Arkhipov is not on board. The launch key turns, the order is executed, and a single nuclear detonation erupts in the waters near the USS Randolph, vaporizing the destroyer USS Beale and killing hundreds of sailors instantly. The shock is absolute. In Washington, the National Security Council is told that an American ship has been destroyed by a nuclear weapon. There is no time to confirm whether it was an isolated act or the beginning of a coordinated strike. Kennedy turns to Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, who lays out the grim reality. The United States has promised massive retaliation for any nuclear attack, regardless of scale. To hold back now would mean inviting further strikes from a Soviet leadership that has already crossed the nuclear threshold. Within the hour, Strategic Air Command moves to DEFCON 1. Bombers armed with thermonuclear weapons rise from airfields across the United States and begin their patrol routes towards Soviet airspace. Minuteman missiles stand ready in their silos. On the other side of the world, Soviet ICM crews in Plesetsk and Turyatam receive coded orders to prepare for immediate launch. Civilians in both nations still go about their daily lives, largely unaware of how close the blade is to the skin. Children are in school, shopkeepers ring up sales, and radio DJs spin popular records while the most destructive force ever devised by human hands is minutes away from being unleashed. Philosophers will later debate whether this moment represents the final proof of humanity's inability to restrain itself when survival feels threatened. Some will say it was inevitable, the logical conclusion of an arms race built on fear and suspicion. Others will see it as the result of individual choices stacked like dominoes until the last one toppled into catastrophe. In the skies over Europe, NATO radar stations begin tracking a swarm of Soviet bombers heading west over the Arctic. Fighter jets scramble from bases in Norway, Britain, and Canada. The clock that historians will later call the last minute is now ticking so loudly that even the people far from the corridors of power can feel it in their bones. Radio signals crackle with coded messages, satellites record the heat blooms of missile launches, and somewhere in the Nevada desert, the ground trembles as silos open to the sky. The fate of the world is no longer in the hands of cautious statesmen or skilled diplomats. It is in the hands of machines, pre-programmed to carry out their orders, and of crews who have been trained to believe that hesitation is more dangerous than action. The sky over the North Atlantic is already glowing with the first arcs of missile contrails. History, as we know it, is ending before most people even know it has changed. The morning of October 29, 1962, begins with a horizon that burns. From the coast of Florida, witnesses report seeing an unnatural sunrise, as if the ocean itself had caught flame. In the command bunkers beneath Washington, New York, and Omaha, phones ring without pause as incoming data confirms what the radar screens are already showing. Multiple Soviet ICBMs have left their silos and are crossing the pole toward North America. There is no longer any ambiguity, no more warnings or brinkmanship. This is war. President Kennedy is rushed from the Oval Office to the White House Situation Room. A secure line from NORAD carries the voice of General Lawrence Cooter, reporting that they have 20 minutes before the first wave of impacts. McNamara presents the pre-planned response options, each one a ladder that climbs directly toward the annihilation of entire cities. The president chooses the only option he believes can prevent total collapse: launch all ready missiles at primary Soviet command and industrial centers. It is the decision that will end the world as it was. From underground silos in Montana, North Dakota, and Wyoming, the blast doors grind open and the first Minuteman missiles surge upward on plumes of fire. B-52 bombers, already in the air, turn toward their targets deep inside the USSR. In the Atlantic, Polaris submarines rise to periscope depth to receive final targeting coordinates. The orders transmitted are simple and irreversible. In Moscow, the Kremlin is a storm of movement. Khrushchev is informed of the incoming American missiles just minutes after his own launch orders have gone out. There is no time to track every trajectory, no room for second-guessing. He orders the full strike to proceed, knowing that every additional weapon launched now is one more that cannot be destroyed in its silo by an American first wave. Somewhere in the tangle of cold calculation and personal pride, the last opportunity for restraint is lost. At 9:04 a.m. Eastern Time, the first Soviet warhead detonates over Thule Air Base in Greenland. The base is instantly vaporized, its radar equipment and crew erased in a single blinding flash. 30 seconds later, another explosion lights up the skies over Newfoundland, followed by strikes on Bangor, Maine, and Plattsburgh, New York. The shockwave shatters windows in Montreal and Boston. Air raid sirens scream across the eastern seaboard as civil defense crews try to guide panicked civilians into overcrowded fallout shelters. In Chicago, traffic grinds to a halt as people abandon their cars to run for basements. In Dallas, the news interrupts morning television with a chilling broadcast. Soviet nuclear strikes confirmed across multiple U.S. targets. Parents pull their children from schools and rush home. There is no official guidance on whether to flee or hide, and so most people simply freeze, trapped between disbelief and dread. Then the counterblows arrive. Over Leningrad, a 9-megaton warhead ignites in the sky, turning the city into an expanding inferno. In Moscow, multiple warheads strike within minutes of each other. The Kremlin vanishes into a pillar of fire, and the great avenues of the capital are transformed into rivers of flame. Tens of thousands are killed instantly. Millions more are burned, blinded, or buried in the rubble of collapsing buildings. Soviet missile fields in Plesetsk and Turyatam are obliterated in the first American salvo, yet not before dozens more missiles have left their launch pads. By the noon hour, the northern hemisphere is a patchwork of firestorms and blackening skies. London is hit by a pair of Soviet strikes aimed at RAF bases, but the blast waves rip through the heart of the city. Paris suffers a similar fate, as does Frankfurt and Brussels. NATO's command network is fractured, but not destroyed. The surviving European forces begin executing their own retaliatory strikes against Warsaw Pact positions in Eastern Europe. Philosophers will later say that this was the moment when civilization ceased to exist as an interconnected system and became instead a scattering of isolated burning islands. Economists will argue that even if the war had stopped here, the collapse of trade, agriculture, and governance would have ended the modern world within weeks. But the war does not stop here. It has only just begun. The Pacific is not spared. American forces in Guam and Okinawa launch missiles towards Soviet bases in Vladivostok and Petropavlovsk. China's leadership, unsure of whether they are the next target, begins mobilizing its own nuclear arsenal. In Australia, the government orders full civil defense measures as rumors spread that Darwin and Perth may be targeted by Soviet submarine-launched missiles. In the Atlantic, the USS Patrick Henry fires its entire complement of Polaris missiles before diving deep into the cold darkness to evade counterattack. One of those missiles strikes Murmansk, the largest city north of the Arctic Circle and home to a key Soviet naval base. The detonation is so intense that the surrounding ice sheet collapses into the Barents Sea, sending waves that carry radioactive debris for hundreds of miles. As the first day of fire wears on, the atmosphere itself begins to change. High-altitude winds carry soot and vaporized soil into the stratosphere, where it forms a dark veil across the sun. The light that filters through is red and sickly, and in many places the temperature begins to drop. Scientists had warned that a full-scale nuclear exchange could trigger a phenomenon later called nuclear winter. In this moment, it ceases to be a theory. In the ruins of Washington, surviving members of Congress gather in an underground shelter beneath the Capitol. The president addresses them briefly, his voice hoarse. He tells them the United States will endure, but the reality outside is already making that impossible. Key ports are gone, rail lines are severed, and most major cities east of the Mississippi have been hit at least once. The chain of command survives, but the nation it commands is in pieces. That night, as fires rage across two continents, the communication lines between Moscow and Washington fall silent. not because the leaders have nothing to say, but because there is nothing left to say that can stop what has been set in motion. Missiles continue to launch from hidden locations, air crews drop their remaining bombs, and submarine captains release their last warheads before disappearing into the ocean depths. By the time the sun rises again, the maps in every war room on Earth will be unrecognizable. The first day of fire ends not with a truce or a ceasefire, but with exhaustion. The weapons have been fired, the targets destroyed, the plans completed. Only the consequences remain, and they will last far longer than the men who ordered them into being. The world after the first day of fire is silent in a way that is almost unbearable. It is not the silence of peace with a quiet after a storm, but the hollow emptiness that comes when every familiar sound is gone. Cities that once roared with engines and voices now echo only with the crackle of distant fires and the groans of collapsing buildings. The air smells of metal and ash, and every breath carries invisible particles that will poison the body slowly and without mercy. In the countryside, far from the craters and firestorms, there are still survivors who wake to a sun they can barely see. The sky is a deep, bruised purple where it is not entirely black, and the light that filters down is dim and red. Birds have stopped singing, cattle wander without herders, and fields lie untended. The radio static carries fragments of voices from what remains of civil defense stations, each one giving different instructions, none of which seem to matter anymore. In Washington, what is left of the federal government operates from a deep bunker under Raven Rock. President Kennedy speaks into a microphone that reaches perhaps a fraction of the people who once listened to him. He promises that the United States remains intact, that the armed forces are still strong, that there will be aid for those who survive. But those words fall into the same void that now swallows all promises, because the nation above him is gone. Rail lines have been severed, highways blocked by wreckage, ports reduced to rubble, and the survivors too scattered to be reached in any organized way. In Moscow, Khrushchev survives in a reinforced shelter beneath the Kremlin ruins. He too records messages for the Soviet people, promising that victory is still within reach. But his armies are blind, his factories destroyed, and his generals unsure whether any further conflict has meaning, when the fields they fight over are poisoned and the cities they defend no longer exist. Here, too, the machinery of government still turns, but it turns without purpose. The philosophers will later call this period the long night. It is not measured in hours, but in the absence of progress. Each day resembles the one before, as the smoke in the sky grows thicker, and the winds carry radioactive ash across the continents. In the north, snow begins to fall earlier than anyone can remember, and it does not melt when it touches the ground. The temperature drops degree by degree until even the fires struggle to burn. For those who survived the initial blasts, the struggle now is hunger. Stored food is quickly exhausted, and what little can be scavenged from ruined cities is often contaminated. Rivers are choked with debris and chemical runoff, and wells are poisoned. People learn to test water by lowering a small animal into it and watching if it survives. This is what human life has been reduced to in less than a week, a guessing game with death where every choice feels like a gamble. In the ruins of Chicago, a group of survivors gathers in the basement of a half-collapsed church. They share what little food they have and tell stories of the world before, as if speaking the past aloud can hold back the darkness outside. A child asks when the lights will come back, and no one has the courage to tell her that the power plants are gone and will not return in her lifetime. In this new reality, hope becomes a form of currency, traded carefully because too much of it will break a person when it is inevitably crushed. Elsewhere, there are those who do not wait for help. Bands of armed men roam the countryside, taking what they need from anyone weaker than themselves. They justify it as survival, but already the seeds of a new order are being planted, one built not on law or cooperation, but on force and fear. In the absence of nations, tribes are forming again, and the borders are drawn in the blood of strangers. The long night is not only physical darkness, but a darkness of the mind. Those who once dreamed of rebuilding now speak only of enduring. The idea of nations and politics feels like a story from an ancient book, something that belonged to another species. The survivors begin to measure time not by dates, but by events. The day of the fire, the day the river froze, the day the last cow died. History becomes oral again, passed in fragments from one voice to another, each retelling a little less complete than the last. And yet even here, in this deep shadow, there are sparks. A doctor in a ruined hospital in Vermont continues to treat the wounded with the supplies she has left. A former engineer in what was once East Berlin begins building windmills to pump clean water from deep wells. A farmer in Western Australia gathers seeds and stores them in clay jars, believing that someday the sun will shine again and they will be planted. These acts are small, and they cannot stop the hunger or the cold, but they keep alive the idea that not everything is lost. Some will later argue that the long night was not the end of humanity, but a kind of purification, that when the cities fell and the nations burned, the noise and corruption of the old world were stripped away, leaving only the essence of survival. Others will say this is a lie told by those who could not bear to face the truth, that something precious died in those days that could never be recovered. What is certain is that the people who walked out of the long night were not the same as those who entered it. Weeks pass without a sunrise bright enough to cast shadows. The ash in the upper atmosphere has spread across the entire globe, dimming the light and lowering the temperature everywhere. Crops fail even in regions untouched by bombs, and the animals that once roamed the fields now lie still in the snow. The oceans, too, begin to change, their currents altered by the sudden cooling, and strange blooms of dead fish wash up on silent beaches. It is during this time that the surviving leaders on both sides attempt their first hesitant contact since the war began. Messages are passed through neutral countries, though many of these governments no longer function in any meaningful way. The purpose is not negotiation, but recognition, an admission that both sides have nothing left to gain and everything left to lose if the fighting continues. But the words come slowly, and the trust more slowly still. Neither side can be sure that the other will not see weakness as an opportunity. The long night stretches on without promise of dawn. The survivors no longer ask when it will end. They only ask whether they will live to see it end at all. The long night does not end with peace, but with division. When the ash clouds thin enough for the first pale sunlight to pierce the gloom, what it reveals is not a united effort to rebuild, but a map of scattered enclaves, each one a fortress against the others. The great nations that once spanned continents are now reduced to clusters of survivors who still claim the old names, though they no longer control more than a few dozen miles in any direction. In place of a global order, there is only a patchwork of territories ruled by whoever can feed and defend the people within their walls. In what remains of the United States, the government's voice grows quieter with each passing month. The bunker under Raven Rock still issues broadcasts declaring that the Union endures, yet these messages reach fewer ears as radios fail and power sources die. Outside the perimeter of federal control, regional militias rise to fill the void. Some are led by former military officers, others by local leaders, who understand that in this new world, authority comes not from election, but from the ability to keep people alive. Borders begin to form along rivers and mountain ranges, and disputes over hunting grounds or scavenging rights escalate into small wars. Across the Atlantic, the ruins of Europe fracture in much the same way. In Britain, the surviving population clusters in fortified towns along the western coast, relying on fishing and trade with Ireland, which escaped the worst of the strikes. On the continent, former NATO allies turn inward. France splinters between northern and southern factions, each claiming to be the true continuation of the state. Germany dissolves into a network of armed city-states, some ruled by former officers, others by civilian councils. In Eastern Europe, the surviving remnants of the Warsaw Pact cling to whatever Soviet support they can still find,
though Moscow's ability to aid them has vanished. In the Asian theater, the collapse takes a different form. China emerges from the war scarred, but still more intact than most powers. Its rural interior becomes the foundation for a new authority centered in Chengdu, far from the radioactive ruin of Beijing. Here, the leadership begins to see opportunity in the global collapse and sends envoys into the shattered states of Southeast Asia, offering protection in exchange for allegiance. This marks the first step in what survivors will later call the Second Expansion. In South America, the absence of northern interference allows local powers to assert themselves. Brazil takes control of much of the Amazon basin, while Argentina reclaims disputed territories from its neighbors. Yet even here, the shadow of the war reaches across the sky as crop failures and shifting weather patterns bring famine to regions untouched by bombs. The competition for fertile land becomes fierce, and alliances are made and broken in a matter of weeks. Philosophers who survived this era will write that the fracturing was inevitable, that when the structures of the old world were destroyed, people reverted to smaller units of loyalty: family, tribe, village. Some will argue that this was a return to a more honest form of human society, where governance was close to the governed and decisions were made face to face. Others will counter that it was merely a regression to the law of the strong, where justice existed only for those who could enforce it. In North America, the breakdown accelerates when supply convoys from the central government failed to reach outlying settlements. Communities that had once waited for Washington's orders now act on their own. Some declare themselves independent republics, complete with flags and charters. Others abandon any pretense of politics and are ruled instead by warlords who trade security for obedience. Skirmishes erupt over surviving fuel depots and warehouses full of pre-war food and ammunition. The government attempts to reclaim these by force, but every victory costs resources that cannot be replaced. The old boundaries between military and civilian life blur. In many enclaves, every adult is armed and trained to fight. Children grow up learning not history or mathematics, but how to identify edible plants, how to purify water, and how to aim a rifle. Education is survival, and survival is war. The cultural memory of the pre-war world begins to fade, replaced by a generation that knows the old nations only as stories. Yet even in the chaos, there are those who dream of rebuilding. In the Western Mountains, a coalition of settlements forms an assembly to coordinate defense and trade. They call themselves the Free Territories and speak openly of one day restoring a unified America. In the ruins of Paris, a group of engineers and medics establish a neutral zone where warring factions can barter without fear of attack. These are fragile beginnings, but they prove that cooperation is still possible even when trust is scarce. Meanwhile, in the East, a more dangerous vision takes shape. From the remnants of the Soviet Far East, a charismatic commander named Colonel Viktor Surov declares himself protector of the people. He claims to be the last legitimate authority of the old Soviet state and broadcasts promises to reunite the motherland under his rule. His forces are disciplined and ruthless, recruiting from scattered military survivors and enforcing strict loyalty through fear. Under Surov's leadership, the Far East becomes a militarized state whose only goal is expansion. It is during this time that the first post-war conflicts between emerging powers ignite. In the Pacific, remnants of the U.S. Navy clash with Chinese patrols over control of supply-rich islands. In Europe, a coalition of surviving city-states launches a campaign against a neighboring warlord whose raids have devastated trade routes. These battles are small compared to the global war that preceded them, yet for the survivors, they are no less devastating. Every loss is felt deeply because every soldier killed is one less hand to plant crops, defend walls, or repair the little infrastructure that remains. The fracturing reshapes the world not into two rival blocks, but into dozens of small, volatile states. Each one is a potential ally or enemy, and often both within the same season. Diplomacy becomes a matter of personal relationships between leaders, rather than treaties between nations. Trust is rare, betrayal common, and the idea of a global community fades into memory. By the end of the second year after the fire, the maps carried by traders and wanderers bear little resemblance to those that hung in classrooms before the war. The old borders are meaningless, and the names of many countries have already been forgotten by those born after the bombs fell. What remains is a world of shifting alliances, constant vigilance, and an unspoken understanding that the smallest spark could ignite another cycle of destruction. In this fractured world, the question is no longer who won the war, but whether humanity can survive the peace that follows.
The world that emerges from the fracturing is unrecognizable to those who remember the age before the fire. Where once there were highways stretching across continents, now there are narrow trails worn by the feet of traders and refugees. Where there were cities of steel and glass, now there are only skeletons of concrete, filled with weeds and the rusting frames of machines that will never run again. The survivors live among the bones of a giant, and each day is a reminder of how high humanity once climbed and how far it has fallen. Children born after the war see the ruins not as losses, but as the natural shape of the world. To them, the cracked streets and silent towers are simply part of the landscape, like mountains or rivers. They do not speak of rebuilding the old world because they never knew it. Their stories are about the struggles of their parents and the lessons those struggles taught. To carry water before anything else, to keep watch at night, to never waste a match. What knowledge survives from the age before is carried in fragments, a battered book, a half-remembered skill, a tool whose original use has been forgotten, but which still serves a purpose. Among the elders, there is debate about what should be taught to the next generation. Some believe the memory of the old world is dangerous, that its abundance and its power led inevitably to arrogance and destruction. They argue for a simpler life, rooted in the land, with no machines beyond what can be made by hand, and no weapons beyond what is needed to hunt and defend. Others believe that forgetting the past is the surest way to repeat it. They tell the children about electricity and engines, about cities that never slept, about flying across oceans and speaking to someone on the other side of the world as easily as calling across a room. They say that one day these things can be built again, and that the mistakes of the past can be avoided if the past is remembered clearly. Philosophers of this era live not in universities, but in camps and markets, moving between settlements to speak with whoever will listen. They carry no degrees, only the conviction that thinking deeply about survival is as important as survival itself. Some ask whether humanity deserves to rise again, or whether the war was a kind of final judgment delivered by its own hands. Others question the very meaning of civilization. If the ability to destroy itself is a measure of advancement, then perhaps advancement is not worth the cost. In some corners of the world, small sparks of organized learning begin to appear. In the free territories of the Western Mountains, a group of teachers gathers children in a rebuilt schoolhouse and uses scavenged books to teach them reading, writing, and arithmetic. In the neutral zone of Paris, medics hold lessons on sanitation and herbal medicine, passing on knowledge that could mean the difference between life and death. These are fragile beginnings, but they are seeds, and seeds have the power to grow even in the cracks of ruins. Trade slowly returns in the form of caravans carrying grain, tools, cloth, and salt between enclaves. With trade comes the exchange of stories, and with stories comes the weaving of a shared identity among scattered peoples. Leaders begin to realize that cooperation yields more than conquest, and the first hesitant alliances are formed. Some fail quickly, torn apart by suspicion or greed, but others endure long enough to plant the idea that perhaps unity is possible again. Still, there are shadows that stretch over every step toward renewal. Pockets of land remain uninhabitable for generations, and shifting weather patterns bring years of drought followed by floods that wash away entire settlements. The memory of the fire is never far from the minds of those who survived it, and the fear that it could happen again shapes every decision. Weapons are guarded closely, and the knowledge of how to build them is hidden or destroyed by those who fear that another war would finish what the last one began. Generations pass, and the scars of the old world begin to fade into myth. Some say the fire was the wrath of gods, others that it was a sickness of the earth that burned itself away. A few still tell the truth as best they can, but even their accounts are colored by the haze of time and the need to make sense of what defies sense. In this way, the inheritance of the survivors is not only the land they hold or the tools they pass on, but the stories they choose to tell and the truths they choose to bury. In a village built on the ruins of what was once a great coastal city, a child sits by a fire, listening to an elder speak of a time when the night was bright with lights that never went out, and the oceans were crossed in hours. The child asks why it all ended, and the elder pauses. There are many answers that could be given, but in the end the elder says only that people forgot how to live without wanting more than they needed. The child nods, not fully understanding, but sensing that this is an important truth, and carries it silently into sleep. The world will never be as it was before the fire. Too much has been lost, too much unlearned, too much scarred into the land itself. But it will not remain as it is either, because change is as much a part of life as hunger or fear. The survivors have given their children a world of ashes, but also the tools to plant in those ashes and the will to guard what grows. Perhaps in another 100 years the ruins will be covered with forests, and the rivers will run clear again. Perhaps villages will become towns, and towns will become cities, and the lights will return to the night. Or perhaps the people will choose a different path, one that never climbs so high and never falls so far. Whatever they choose, the future will be theirs, and not the inheritance of the dead. In this, the philosophers will agree that survival is not victory, but it is the first step toward whatever victory may come, and that the lesson of the fire is not how the world ended, but how it began again in hands too young to remember the flames.